In today's video, I would like to teach you how to do to what extent questions. These type of questions can appear in both DBQ questions and essay questions, and it usually comes with "do agree." So in this type of questions, you need to explain and answer whether you large extent, certain extent, or small extent agree or disagree with the question or the statement used in the question. For example, if you answer agree, then you will need to explain to the marker and the reader about why you chose to a large extent, certain extent, or small extent in your argument and counter argument using the rebuttal section. So now what do these different extents mean? For example, for small extent, agree, you in fact still agree with the statement of the question, but only to a small extent. So by having a small extent doesn't mean that you disagree. So you will need to explain why you did not disagree, but only to a small extent agree, instead of certain or large. As for certain extent, if you choose this stance, you generally is telling the marker or the reader that you are not entirely sure. It is neither large or small, and that's why you need to explain why, despite of the arguments and counter arguments, you are going for the certain extent instead of a large or small. So now I have a few ideal structures for writing to what extent essays. In fact, I only have two different structures. The first will be to provide all your arguments first. For example, if you say to a large extent agree, then you tell your reader why you agree for the first points and sections, and then you give counter arguments. Some arguments that your opposition side or those who disagree will point out, and then you do a rebuttal by explaining why, despite you see these different disagreements, but you still think that it's a large extent valid statement or question. So you need to explain why you choose a large, certain, small extent, agree or disagree in the rebuttal section based on counter arguments. For example, if you use large extent, then your argument should be more than your counter argument in general, and then you will need to explain your stance in the rebuttal section. Whereas for certain extent, you will probably need somewhere the same amount of arguments and counter arguments, and for small extent, you will need more counter arguments than arguments. So as for the second option, which is a more advanced version, and the one I personally like to use, is to first mention argument and then counter argument for your own argument, or is related to your argument, and then you do a rebuttal right at the paragraph or the section. So this entire argument, counter argument, and rebuttal in every single paragraph or section will become one set. And this will make your essay look more sophisticated and also more interesting to read. However, it takes more organizational skills and language abilities. And you explain in each paragraph very clearly why you chose a certain sense, like large, certain, or small extent, agree or disagree. So you will need to be very clear in terms of logic and then in terms of your language. So some tips for writing this kind of essay about to what extent is to first write a draft. I always emphasize the importance of writing a draft, especially putting down points and then sometimes topic sentences to remind you always about what you are going to write about. And it helps you think a little bit more about whether you are arguing in the right track or whether the stance you initially thought about was really that easy to write about. So I think writing a draft is very important in writing a to what extent question to prevent contradiction. especially when you write halfway through and you start getting confused or less clear about what you are writing about. As for the second tip I would like to give you is about the quantity and quality of arguments. Sometimes you don't really go for quantitative, like how many arguments. Sometimes it's not more about whether you have more arguments or more counter arguments. It's more about how important the arguments are. For example, for Treaty of Versailles, we usually say it's probably one of the most important causes of the Second World War because it caused a lot of different other problems, such as the weakness of League of Nations. And then we can see how the only one cause, Treaty of Versailles, was very important in causing a lot of other problems in Europe at that time, leading to a higher possibility of Second World War. So it's more of an important cause than a quantitative cause. So sometimes we can argue in the general direction that despite you only have one argument, but it is more important than those in the counter arguments, and therefore your stance. And then the last tip is to always check your logic while writing your essay and your draft. So make sure that you don't sound that you are arguing for a different stance halfway through the essay. Always check that you are answering in the correct direction, and this all comes down to your writing of draft. That's why this is where writing a draft comes into place. Always check against your draft about what you're writing about, or if you would like to change anything that is within the draft, you always refer back to see if there's any logical problems.